Hello and welcome to Her Revenge Arc, the channel where we delve into stories of justice, of quiet strength, and of the moments when the underestimated finally claim their power. I am your storyteller, and tonight, I invite you to settle in to listen closely as we unfold a tale not of loud, explosive anger, but of a quiet, calculated reckoning. This is a story about how the deepest love can forge the most unshakable defenses, and how greed in its haste often overlooks the most important details. This is my story. It began, as so many of our stories do, with an ending. Two endings, in fact. My mother's came first, a slow, gentle fade after a long illness that had hollowed out her laughter but never her spirit. My father followed her 6 months later, not from any sickness the doctors could name, but from what the old poets would call a broken heart. He simply stopped. One morning, he went to sleep in his favorite armchair overlooking the garden my mother had so lovingly tended, and he never woke up. In the space of half a year, my world, once a vibrant tapestry woven with their love and wisdom, had been reduced to a single fraying thread. Me and the house. I cannot tell this story without telling you about the house. It was not a mansion, not a grand estate, but it was our kingdom. Built by my grandfather, a carpenter with more skill in his hands than money in his pockets, it was a living thing. It was a house of secrets and stories, of wood that smelled of beeswax and thyme, of windows that framed the changing seasons like masterpieces in a gallery. Every creak of the floorboards was a familiar footstep, every shadow in the hallway a comforting presence. My father, an architect by trade, had spent his life lovingly preserving and enhancing my grandfather's work. He'd added a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, a sunroom where the winter light could be trapped and savored, and a small, hidden workshop in the basement where he'd tinker with clocks and broken things. The house wasn't just brick and mortar. It was a testament to my family's history, a physical archive of our love. It was my last tangible connection to the two people I had loved more than anything in the universe. In the immediate aftermath of my father's passing, a thick fog of grief descended upon me, so dense I could barely see my own hand in front of my face. The world was muted, the colors bled out. I moved through the necessary motions, the phone calls, the arrangements, the quiet signing of papers in a state of numb detachment. It was during this period of profound vulnerability that the vultures began to circle. My relatives, specifically my father's sister, Carol, her husband, Mark, and their daughter Jessica. Growing up, they had always been a peripheral part of our lives, appearing for major holidays with smiles that never quite reached their eyes and gifts that felt more like obligations than offerings. I'd always sensed a current of resentment flowing just beneath the surface of Aunt Carol's saccharine sweetness. She saw my father's quiet contentment, his happy marriage, and the beautiful home he'd nurtured, not as things he had earned and built, but as things she had been denied. She spoke of the house not as your father's home, but as the family home, subtly staking a claim that had no basis in reality. Uncle Mark was a man who lived in his wife's shadow, his own disappointment souring into a perpetual, low-grade bitterness that he directed at anyone who seemed to have it better, which, in his eyes, was my father. And Jessica, my cousin, was the polished product of their envy. A young woman with an unshakable sense of entitlement and a thinly veiled disdain for my quieter, more academic pursuits. They arrived the day after the funeral, their car pulling into the gravel driveway with a self-important crunch. They didn't come bearing casseroles or condolences. They came bearing suitcases. "Oh, you poor thing," Aunt Carol cooed, enveloping me in a hug that felt like a cage. Her perfume was cloying, too sweet. "All alone in this big old house. Don't you worry, Alara. We're here now. We'll take care of everything." Take care of everything was a euphemism, I would soon learn, for take everything. In my fog of grief, I didn't have the strength to protest. It started small. Carol would move a photograph of my parents, replacing it with one of her own family. "Just to brighten the place up a bit, dear," she'd say with that brittle smile. Mark started parking his oversized truck in the spot where my father's modest sedan had always sat, an act of territorial pissing that felt like a desecration. Jessica would wander through the rooms, her eyes scanning everything with a cold, appraising stare, as if she were taking inventory for an auction. She'd pick up my mother's porcelain music box, turn it over in her hands, and set it down with a dismissive sniff. They treated my grief as an inconvenience, a temporary state of insanity from which I would eventually recover, by which time they would be firmly entrenched. They spoke about my future in front of me as if I weren't there. "She'll probably want to move to the city," Carol would say to Mark over dinner, her voice loud enough for me to hear from the living room. "A fresh start. This house is far too much for a single girl to manage." The word manage was a key they turned again and again. They painted a picture of me as fragile, incapable, a damsel in distress who needed their worldly wisdom to survive. In reality, I knew every secret of that house. I knew the precise pressure needed to turn the temperamental boiler on, the spot on the roof that needed checking after a heavy rain, the way to coax the stubborn rose bushes my mother had planted into blooming. I had learned it all from my father, but in their narrative I was a helpless child. The day of the will reading was the day the fog began to lift, replaced by the cold, sharp clarity of betrayal. We gathered in the office of Mr. Davies, my father's longtime friend and lawyer. He was a kind, solemn man with eyes that held a deep sadness for my loss. He looked at me with genuine sympathy before he began, a stark contrast to the barely concealed, ravenous anticipation radiating from Carol, Mark, and Jessica. They sat together on a leather sofa, a united front of greed. Mr. Davies cleared his throat and began to read. The language was formal, legalistic, but the core of it was simple. My father had left me a significant portfolio of stocks and a healthy savings account, enough to ensure I would be financially secure for the rest of my life. I felt a wave of relief, and a fresh pang of love for his foresight and care. Then Mr. Davies got to the part about the house. He paused, and the air in the room grew thick. Regarding the property at 14 Willow Creek Lane, he read, his voice steady. The house and all its contents, I bequeath it to my sister Carol and her husband Mark. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I couldn't breathe. I looked from Mr. Davies's somber face to the triumphant, gloating expressions on the faces of my relatives. Carol's hand flew to her chest in a theatrical display of shock, but her eyes were gleaming. Jessica shot me a look of pure, unadulterated victory. It was a smirk that said, "We won. You lost." My mind reeled. How? Why? My father loved me. He loved this house. He knew what it meant to me. He knew what they were like. It made no sense. It was a betrayal so profound it threatened to shatter the last vestiges of my composure. I felt a stinging behind my eyes, but I refused to cry. Not in front of them. I bit the inside of my cheek, the sharp pain a welcome anchor in the swirling chaos of my thoughts. Of course, Carol said, her voice dripping with false humility. We will naturally allow Alara to stay for as long as she needs to. Get on her feet. The implication was clear. I was now a guest in my own home, living on their charity. I don't remember leaving the office. I remember the feeling of the cold city air on my hot face, the sound of their gleeful hushed chatter behind me. I walked home in a daze, each step heavier than the last. The house, when I reached it, no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a tomb, a monument to my loss and their victory. That evening they held a small celebration. They ordered expensive takeout and opened a bottle of champagne. I could hear their laughter from my bedroom upstairs, loud and unrestrained. I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the fragments of my father's character with this inexplicable act. It was impossible. The man who taught me to read by tracing the words in his favorite books, the man who built me a treehouse with his own hands, the man who held my mother's hand every single day of their life together, that man would not do this. He would not leave me to the wolves. The next morning my phone rang. It was Mr. Davies. Alara, he said, his voice low and urgent. Can you come to my office this afternoon? Alone. There's something more we need to discuss. Something that was not for other ears. A tiny flickering ember of hope ignited in the cold ashes of my despair. I agreed immediately. When I arrived at his office, the atmosphere was entirely different. The professional solemnity was gone, replaced by a warm, almost paternal concern. He led me to a different room, a smaller, more comfortable study lined with books. He poured me a cup of tea, his movements slow and deliberate. Alara, he began, leaning forward in his chair. First, I want to apologize for the theatricality of yesterday. Your father insisted on it. He knew his sister, and he knew what would happen. I just stared at him, my mind struggling to catch up. He smiled, a genuine, gentle smile. Your father was one of the most intelligent and perceptive men I have ever known. He loved you more than anything. Did you really think he would leave you unprotected? He then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a different envelope, this one sealed with wax bearing my father's initial. This, he said, is a codicil to the will. An addendum. Your father and I drew it up a month before he passed. He made me swear to only reveal it to you after the main will had been read. My hands trembled as I took the envelope. I broke the seal and unfolded the thick cream-colored paper. It was my father's handwriting, the familiar, elegant script I knew so well. My eyes scanned the page, and as I read, the world tilted back onto its axis. The fog cleared completely, and in its place was a plan so intricate, so brilliant, so deeply and intimately my father, that I let out a sound that was half a sob, half a laugh. The codicil was a work of art. It was a trap, baited with the one thing my relatives could never resist, the house. It stated that the bequest of the property to Carol and Mark was, in fact, conditional. They would only take full, legal ownership of the house after a probationary period of exactly 1 year. And during that year, they had to abide by a set of meticulously detailed conditions, which my father, with the loving precision of an architect and the foresight of a protective parent, had named the Covenants of Care. The covenants were not about money. They were about respect. They were a test of character designed to be failed by people like Carol and Mark. There were dozens of clauses. The century-old oak floors in the main hallway had to be waxed by hand, once a month, with a specific brand of beeswax imported from a small apiary in France. The vast collection of first edition books in the library had to be maintained at a specific humidity level, which required daily monitoring of a complex, old-fashioned humidifier my father had built himself. The collection of rare orchids my mother had cultivated in the greenhouse orchids that required a precise schedule of misting, feeding, and temperature control had to be kept alive and blooming. Any dead or wilted plant would constitute a breach of the covenant. The intricate rosewood inlay on my father's desk had to be polished weekly with a special oil, the recipe for which was included, and which had to be mixed by hand. The list went on and on. It was a litany of love, a catalogue of all the small dedicated acts of care my parents had poured into the house over the years. My father had weaponized their own reverence for the home against anyone who would treat it with disrespect. And the final clause was the masterstroke. It stated that if, at the end of the 365-day period, an independent assessor, chosen by Mr. Davies, found that even a single one of the covenants of care had been violated, the inheritance of the property would be rendered null and void. In that event, the house and all its contents would revert immediately and irrevocably to me, his daughter, Ilara. And to add insult to injury, any and all money Carol and Mark had spent on upgrades or improvements during their year of occupancy would be considered a gift, non-refundable. My father had not disinherited me. He had given me the ultimate gift, a path to justice paved with my relatives' own greed and laziness. He had trusted that I, his daughter, would understand the soul of the house and that they, in their arrogance, would see only the prize, never the responsibility. I looked up at Mr. Davies, tears now streaming freely down my face. But they were not tears of grief. They were tears of overwhelming love, of gratitude, of awe at my father's brilliant, posthumous chess move. He knew, I whispered. He knew them so well. He did, Mr. Davies confirmed. His instruction to me was simple. Let them have the house, David. Let them think they've won. Their true nature will do the rest. Ilara will know what to do. And I did. A plan began to form in my mind, a quiet and patient strategy. I would not fight them. I would not argue or scream. I would simply let them be themselves. I would become a ghost in my own home, an observer, a silent witness to their downfall. I went home that day a different person. The grief was still there, a heavy cloak I would carry for a long time, but now it was lined with purpose. When I walked through the front door, I saw Carol directing Mark as he tried, and failed, to move my father's heavy leather armchair. "This dreary old thing has to go," she was saying. "We'll get a nice modern sectional in here. Something in gray." The old me would have burst into tears. The new me simply watched, my expression placid. I made a mental note. Violation of the implicit covenant to respect the original furnishings. The will didn't explicitly forbid redecorating, but their approach was one of erasure, not care. This was just the beginning. I moved into the smallest guest room at the back of the house, telling them I needed my space. They were only too happy to have me out of the way. My presence the first month was the flurry of their activity. They were drunk on their perceived victory. They bought new furniture, cheap flat-pack stuff that looked jarringly out of place against the warm, aged wood of the house. They painted over a wall in the living room that had been a soft, buttery yellow with a harsh, sterile white, their roller strokes careless, leaving splatters on the dark oak baseboards. I didn't say a word. I just took a photograph with my phone when they were out. Their attention to the covenants of care was, as my father had predicted, abysmal. The French beeswax for the floors was deemed too expensive and fussy. Carol bought a cheap, generic polish from the supermarket, which she had Mark slosh on the floor with a mop. It left a greasy, sticky residue that dulled the wood's natural luster instead of enriching it. I documented the receipt, which she'd carelessly left on the kitchen counter, and took close-up photos of the smeary, lifeless floor. The library was their next casualty. The complex humidifier my father had built was a mystery to them. Mark fiddled with it for a day, couldn't figure it out, declared it broken, and unplugged it. The air in the library grew dry. The leather bindings of the old books, which my father had so carefully conditioned, began to feel stiff and brittle to the touch. The delicate pages grew fragile. I would sneak in at night, the scent of dyeing paper filling my nostrils, and document the falling humidity levels with the small hygrometer I'd bought. But the greenhouse was the scene of the greatest carnage. It was the heart of my mother's passion. My Aunt Carol, who couldn't keep a plastic cactus alive, looked at the collection of rare, delicate orchids as a nuisance. She assigned the task of their care to Jessica, who was even less interested. For a week, Jessica would half-heartedly splash some water in their general direction, but her attention soon waned, diverted by social media and online shopping. The precise misting schedule was ignored. The special nutrient-rich food my mother used to mix was forgotten. I watched day by day, as the vibrant green leaves of the Phalaenopsis began to yellow at the edges. The delicate, moth-like petals of the prized white egret orchid, my mother's favorite, turned brown and fell to the stone floor. It was heartbreaking. Each wilting plant felt like a personal blow, a fresh wave of grief. But I channeled that pain into resolve. I took time-stamped photographs every single day, creating a grim time-lapse chronicle of their neglect. They were so confident in their ownership, so blinded by their prize, that they never once suspected a thing. They saw my quiet compliance as weakness, my grief as a convenient distraction. They had no idea that my silence was a weapon, that my sorrow was fuel. Months passed. The house began to show the strain of their carelessness. A small leak in the sunroom roof, something my father would have noticed and fixed in an afternoon, was ignored until it left a large, ugly brown stain on the ceiling. The rosewood inlay on his desk, deprived of its special oil, grew dull and dry, the wood looking thirsty and sad. The covenants were not just being broken. They were being systematically dismantled by sheer apathy. My role was that of a quiet archivist of their failure. I filled a secure digital folder with hundreds of photos, videos, and dated notes. I scanned receipts for the cheap cleaning products they used. I recorded short audio clips of them complaining about the house's demanding nature. "It's like the bloody thing is alive and trying to annoy us," I heard Mark grumble one evening. He had no idea how right he was. The year was a long, slow exercise in patience and pain. Seeing the home I loved so much being treated with such disdain was a constant, dull ache in my chest. There were days I wanted to scream, to throw the codicil in their faces and watch the smug looks melt into horror. But I held back, clinging to my father's plan, trusting his wisdom. Mr. Davies and I spoke once a month. I would give him updates and he would offer quiet words of encouragement. "Patience, Alara," he'd say. "The longest year of your life will be the shortest of theirs." Finally, the day arrived. The 365th day. The end of the probationary period. Mr. Davies had scheduled the final assessment for 3 in the afternoon. He had hired a renowned heritage property assessor, a stern-looking woman named Miss Albright, whose reputation for thoroughness was legendary. Carol and Mark were in a celebratory mood. They had spent the morning tidying up, a frantic, superficial cleaning that did nothing to hide a year's worth of neglect. They clearly believed this assessment was a mere formality, the final rubber stamp on their victory. They greeted Mr. Davies and Miss Albright at the door with wide, confident smiles. Come in," Carol said, beaming. "Can I get you some tea? We've been taking such good care of the place. It's a wonderful old house, but it needs a firm hand." Miss Albright did not smile. She held a clipboard and a digital camera. "That will not be necessary, thank you," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "I'd like to begin in the main hallway." I stayed in the background, a silent observer. The show was about to begin. They started with the floors. Miss Albright knelt, running a gloved hand over the surface. She scraped a tiny sample of the waxy buildup into a vial. "The covenant specifies a pure carnauba beeswax," she stated, not as a question but as a fact. "This residue is a petroleum-based acrylic polish. It suffocates the wood. Covenant 1 breached." Carol's smile faltered. "Well, it's very expensive, that French wax." Miss Albright simply made a note on her clipboard and moved on, her gaze sweeping over the baseboards. Paint splatters on the original oak trim, a clear sign of careless workmanship. She took a photo. They moved to the library. The moment she stepped inside, Miss Albright's nose wrinkled slightly. She checked her own professional hygrometer. "Humidity is at 28%, she announced. "The covenant specifies a range of 50 to 55% to preserve the vellum and leather bindings. The humidifier is non-operational. Covenant 7 breached." She walked to a shelf and pulled out a 19th century volume of Dickens. The leather on the spine cracked audibly as she opened it. "Irreversible damage," she murmured, more to herself than to them. Mark began to sweat. "The blasted thing was broken when we got here," he blustered. "The covenant specifies maintenance, which includes repair," Miss Albright countered without looking at him. She was a machine of methodical destruction. The tour of horrors continued. They went from room to room, and with every stop, Miss Albright's list of violations grew longer. The stained ceiling in the sunroom, the dull, lifeless rosewood on my father's desk, the cheap, flimsy lock they'd installed on the front door, replacing the original, intricate iron one my grandfather had forged. The final stop was the greenhouse. By now, Carol was pale and silent, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Mark was a blotchy, angry red. Jessica, who had been scrolling on her phone, finally looked up, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The greenhouse was a wasteland. A few resilient ferns survived, but the orchids, the jewels of the collection, were all dead. Their desiccated brown stalks stood in their pots like tiny skeletal monuments to neglect. Miss Albright's face was grim. She walked along the rows, tapping each dead plant with the end of her pen. "Covenants 12 through 34, she said, her voice ringing with finality. "All breached. Total loss of the entire collection of Orchidaceae." She turned to face Carol and Mark. her expression like that of a judge about to pass sentence. In my professional opinion, she said, her voice clear and cold, this property has not been maintained. It has been systematically neglected. The terms of the covenants of care, as laid out in the legal document I was provided, have been comprehensively and flagrantly violated. She handed the clipboard to Mr. Davies. He took it and looked at my aunt and uncle. The kindly lawyer was gone, replaced by a man executing the final wishes of his dear friend. Carol, Mark, he said, his voice quiet but carrying immense weight. As per the codicil to your brother's will, your conditional inheritance of this property is now null and void. He reached into his briefcase and produced another document. This is the formal notice. The ownership of the property at 14 Willow Creek Lane, and all its contents including any additions or improvements you have made over the past year reverts, effective immediately, to its sole and rightful heir Elara. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. The silence that followed was absolute. It was so complete I could hear the frantic pounding of my own heart. Carol's face crumpled, the mask of civility shattering to reveal the raw, ugly greed beneath. Mark looked as though he'd been struck by lightning. Jessica's jaw was on the floor, her phone forgotten in her lap. What? No, Carol finally shrieked, her voice high and shrill. You can't do this. It's our house. The will said. The will said it was conditional, Mr. Davies interrupted, his voice firm as steel. You failed to meet the conditions. Your own choices led to this outcome. Your brother knew you better than you knew yourselves. That was the line that broke them. The realization that this wasn't a random misfortune, but a perfectly laid trap, designed by the very man they thought they had outsmarted. They had been weighed, they had been measured, and they had been found wanting. The next 48 hours were a symphony of satisfying chaos. There was screaming, there were accusations, there were slammed doors. They tried to pack the new furniture they'd bought, but Mr. Davies calmly pointed to the clause stating that all additions became part of the property. Their cheap gray sectional, their flimsy particle board tables, all of it now belonged to me. They left with nothing but their suitcases and their bitterness, their car peeling out of the driveway, leaving a spray of angry gravel in its wake. The moment the car was gone, a profound silence settled over the house. It was no longer the oppressive silence of their presence, but a peaceful, welcoming silence. I walked through the rooms, my house, my home. It was wounded, yes. It was neglected. But it was not broken. Its bones were good. Its soul was intact. Mr. Davies stood with me in the doorway. He would be so proud of you, Elara, he said softly. Of your patience. Your strength. I looked out at the garden my mother had loved, at the workshop where my father had created, at the sturdy, loving walls my grandfather had built. The inheritance wasn't the house itself. It was the wisdom to protect it. It was the love that had foreseen this moment and provided me with the tools for justice. My revenge wasn't loud or fiery. It was quiet, it was patient, and it was absolute. It was the simple, irrefutable truth that they were not worthy of the legacy they had tried to steal. And as I stood there, key in my hand, I began to make a new list in my head. Not a list of violations, but a list of restorations. The first item on the list. Find the best, most expensive, most wonderfully fragrant French beeswax, and bring the shine back to my father's floors. The house was waiting. It was time to bring it back to life. So I ask you, as you reflect on this story, have you ever had to find strength not in confrontation, but in quiet observation? Have you ever realized that the greatest weaknesses of others can become your most powerful tools? Share your thoughts and your own stories in the comments below. Your experiences give strength to us all. And if this story resonated with you, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribing to her revenge arc for more tales of quiet, satisfying justice. Until next time, be strong, be patient, and trust in your own story.